Welcome back to another episode of ITU Tech Monthly, a snapshot go-to podcast focusing on the latest insights and innovations in the world of technology. Brought to you by ITU, the United Nations Agency for Digital Technologies. I'm your host, Max Jacobson Gonzalez, and today we're diving into a topic that's literally out of this world: space safety. As the number of satellites in orbit skyrockets, so do the risks. From orbital debris to radiofrequency interference, the challenges of managing space as a shared domain are growing fast. And who better to help us unpack this than our guest today, who is Thomas Gonzalez Roberts. No relation, but maybe we're long-distance cousins. But he's actually the academic in residence at the International Telecommunication Union and an incoming assistant professor at Georgia Tech, where he leads research on international coordination, sustainability, and security in outer space. A very responsible and important position. So, Thomas, welcome to Tech Monthly.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the academic in residence, a new post, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about it to start off with.
Sure. I'm privileged to be the first ITU academic in residence, but certainly not the first collaborator in academia to work with our colleagues here at the ITU. The goal of the program is to increase collaboration with ITU career staff and academics around the world who are asking tough questions about coordination in a number of the different service areas of the organization. So for me specifically, that's space services. How, as a global community, we distribute and administer a system of sharing some inherently limited natural resources. Famously, here at the ITU, that includes radio frequencies, but that also includes physical positions or real estate in popular orbital regimes.
Okay, well, let's start with the big picture. You said that space safety is now at the heart of the global conversation. What has changed?
Space safety refers to the threats facing satellites in orbit around the Earth, things that challenge their fundamental missions, providing services often to users on the ground. So what's changed in recent years is the vast number of other space objects operating in similar orbital trajectories. Not just the numbers of active satellites, which has been skyrocketing in the past few years due to the advent of large and high-density constellations, but also fragmented debris or pieces of derelict satellites that are in drift, natural, uncontrolled orbit, also predominantly in those popular orbital regimes.
And how many are we talking about here? Thousands? Tens of thousands?
The right order of magnitude for the active number of satellites is about 10,000, more than 2/3 of which is operated by a single operator. I'm sure we'll talk more about that later.
Absolutely. Yeah, in fact, I was just in the Grand Canyon recently, and we did a little night walk, and they were showing us the night sky and the constellations and all of those kind of things. But and we saw, goodness knows how many satellites flying past now. I mean, the night sky, if you're in a good place to view it, is full of satellites nowadays.
That's right. The satellites that you're observing are really not that far away, but they're also largely a mirrored surface. A solar panel that provides the onboard power system with enough energy to do its work is reflective. And what you're seeing is a glint of the sun's light. It's maybe beautiful to someone who hasn't observed it for the first time before, but it's a growing problem in the broader community of those of us who use space and space-enabled technologies, specifically astronomers, who need to study a cold and dark night sky that's now being polluted by those thousands of satellites I was just telling you about.
And now you hosted a fascinating panel recently with experts from around the world. One of the key themes was the relationship between space safety, security, and sustainability. I think they were looking at the big three here. How do you see those concepts interacting?
Sure. That was an episode of a webinar series called Space Connect, which has been pioneered here at ITU in collaboration with the Office of the Secretary General. And the goal of Space Connect is to tell the global community about the ITU's role in space telecommunications, one that has stretched back decades. The team here, and I'm part of the Space Services Department, is 50 members strong, making it the most staffed international organization for space affairs. And that's something that's not realized in the international community. What we were talking about on that episode, and I had 3 guests, colleagues from the International Academy, we were talking about the intersection of those 3 terms. So satellites are not just threatened by pieces of debris that might come towards them, but we're thinking about longer term problems of operating in a higher and higher density environment. And that long-term view of this problem is at the heart of issues of sustainability. How can we accommodate the missions of today and the many missions that we can imagine tomorrow while maintaining some semblances of freedom of operation, the kind of innovative spirit that brought us to the space domain in the first place? And the sort of elephant in the room in the space domain is using space technologies for international security, protecting states' and alliances' interests, not in the space domain entirely, but using the space domain. Although the outer space domain has been militarized from its very inception, there's never been a war in outer space, making it the only domain that humans have ever visited in which they haven't had that kind of conflict.
Unless you've been to the cinema, of course, in which case Star Wars...
you might find a few examples from books and media.
Indeed. But talking about tech, companies like SpaceX, for example, are using AI to enhance space safety. Is that a game changer?
Sure. We talked about this on the episode, and I think it was of great interest to our audience. Some of the ideas about how to use artificial intelligence to make outer space more coordinated, more sustainable, and more secure are not hypothetical, but are actually employed in practice today. One example that captured the interest of the guest panelists was the use of AI for collision avoidance. So SpaceX, as the largest satellite operator, they operate something like 7,000 of those 10,000 satellites. So this is a pretty big majority here. They employ automated collision avoidance to pursue small maneuvers, sort of firing their thrusters on board those satellites to effectively dodge pieces of debris and other active satellites controlled by actors around the world to prolong the life of those satellites themselves, but also ensure that there are not new fragmentary debris generation events. Avoiding collisions in orbit is a responsibility of all space actors around the world. But what's interesting is the method for how they do that. Using AI for this particular purpose is new territory, one in which I think we have to think about some of the ramifications if there were to be a collision between 2 objects, one of which used not a human, but a computer to decide how to pursue a maneuver. If that were the cause of a collision. And that's an interesting thought exercise, and we enjoyed having that conversation. I think it's one that spans physics, aerospace engineering, certainly international affairs and how states interact with one another, and important disciplines in social science, how humans assess a situation with different amounts of information.
I guess because AI can make those calculations very quickly, it can predict, it can look at patterns and predict possibly elements that we wouldn't be able to necessarily foresee and that kind of thing. Is AI being used for anything else in space at the moment?
I use AI. I'm an astrodynamicist, meaning I track and characterize where satellites are. I use AI to better understand satellites' patterns of life or how they change in their behavior over time. What actually drew me to the ITU was this is the home for where space mission operators around the world, one of the few homes where they share their plans for what they want to use the space domain for. They tell their partners, ITU administrations around the world, where they want to be, what frequencies they want to use. And in some cases, analysts like me can also get other clues about what those missions might really entail. And I like to think about the differences between that purported behavior, what they say they're going to do, and what they're actually going to do. And I use optical telescopes, radar systems on the ground. These are networks of sensors that collect what I call mountains of data, orbital elements or descriptions of orbital trajectories that change over time. We're talking about millions of lines of data. We can't even use spreadsheets to store these. They're too big. And AI is particularly well suited to parse through that mountain for me to detect how patterns have changed over time. Satellites that are now operated in this dense environment behave fundamentally differently than an environment that was sparse merely 15 years ago. In some cases, these are the same satellites. Some satellites last upwards of 30 years.
I was going to ask you about the proliferation of satellites, because you mentioned SpaceX having 7,000 of those 10,000 satellites out there.
Yeah.
I mean, going back 15 years, there would have been a much smaller number of satellites. Why is there a need for so many satellites up there? Wouldn't one or two or 100 very efficient satellites be enough?
To answer that last question, that hypothetical, would a small number of highly efficient satellites be enough? I think the answer might be yes to that question. Yes, for how we use space today. But what's so exciting are some important parameters of the space environment that are really changing right now. One of which is the cost of launch. It's cheaper than ever to get to the space domain. It costs money to build a satellite, but that cost is getting cheaper and cheaper, meaning we can envision new missions that don't exist today, for which we cannot use some of those operational satellites, but they need to be developed anew and placed in space today. There's only a very small culture of changing a satellite mission that's already operational. We call that on-orbit servicing.
Right.
It's happened in history to go and robotically change what a satellite has, swap its payload, make it do something today that it couldn't do yesterday. But largely, if you want a satellite to do a new thing, you need to launch a new satellite.
Right. So, and similarly, if you want to take it out of action, is there anything that you can do? I mean, you get a satellite bin men up there, satellite refuse collectors to pick up the satellites that aren't working anymore, or you just let them keep going round and round?
After a satellite finishes its operational lifetime, satellite operators around the world are encouraged, sometimes by non-legally binding resolution, other times by national law, for which they can be held accountable in their state, to remove their satellites from popular orbital regimes. And that means expending a little bit of onboard propellant, the same fuel that let the satellite last as long as it did, to maneuver it from that popular orbital regime to one that's not so popular. So at very high altitudes, the most popular orbital regime, more than 30,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface, is called the geosynchronous orbital regime. The recommendation is to get out of there and instead raise your altitude to the much less useful supersynchronous orbital regime. Or where we see exponential growth, the most popular orbital regime is called low Earth orbit, just above the upper reaches of our atmosphere.
Leo.
Yeah. We have lots of nicknames in the space domain. Geosynchronous is called Geo.
Right.
In Leo, the recommendation is to drive your altitude down, to burn up in the atmosphere and remove your satellite from the system that way, which I hope, and a lot of listeners do pick up on this, that might be an offset of one problem area, space debris, to another.
Sure.
Environmental impacts in the upper atmosphere.
Yes, exactly. So trying to solve one problem but creating more.
It's really an unknown. That's actually a quite understudied question. It doesn't sound good, right? To be dissolving satellites that are predominantly made of metal alloys into our atmosphere. No. But right now, states around the world have almost unanimously endorsed that activity.
Right, okay. All right, well, and let's see.
Plan A for now.
Yeah, okay, we'll watch that space. No pun intended. What about the economic side? Are companies really willing to sacrifice profits for sustainability?
That's a good question. I think we see that when it comes to these non-legally binding resolutions. So right now you can ask that question in the real environment. Look at the population of actively controlled satellites and ask, who is willing to trade a little bit of mission operation lifetime, a few months of revenue, to adhere to this recommendation? I would argue that almost all actions in space sustainability have some sort of mission operator cost. You must choose to lower your mission quality just a bit in order to adhere to these recommendations. And in short, some satellite operators are willing to do it and some aren't. And we can see some measurable differences across important satellite characteristics, like what country did this satellite originate from? How old is the satellite? If the satellite's at the very tail end of its operational life and it's retiring, you actually can assume that everything pretty much went right for that satellite. If a very young satellite is retiring, you might assume that something's going wrong. Some portion of that satellite didn't perform the way it had intended. Those satellites often don't adhere to space sustainability guidelines.
Before we wrap up, what should our listeners be watching for in the future?
Sure. I think what our listeners should be looking for is the diversification of operators in this high-density LEO constellation space. There are some household names, or maybe name, that I think a lot of listeners might be familiar with, and for good reason. SpaceX is a dominant player in the environment. And I say that they have solved the geometric problem of offering high-speed, low-latency broadband internet to the world's population. They have enough satellites to do it. But they are not the only company with the interest and the capital to do the same. So in coming years, you'll be familiar with more companies that will offer important competition to SpaceX in a number of different sectors. So one company already makes news here at ITU, OneWeb. Another company, Project Kuiper, is another to watch. And I think when we see more of these companies, we'll really witness a true economy of space-enabled technologies that come all the way down to the consumer or household level in a way that we haven't seen before in the history of space operations. That's a real change where issues of space sustainability, will my satellite who's providing internet to my house crash or not, is a family issue and not one of state governments or military agencies around the world.
Fabulous. Well, Thomas, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure we'll catch up with you again at some stage in the future. And this has been a first conversation for us, and I'm sure it won't be the last. That's it for this episode of Tech Monthly, which has been brought to you by ITU, the United Nations Agency for Digital Technologies. If you want to learn more about space sustainability, check out ITU's Space Connect series. And a big thank you to Thomas Gonzalez Roberts for sharing his insights and expertise with us today. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Thomas.
Thank you.
Remember to subscribe to ITU Tech Monthly wherever you get your podcasts for more exciting discussions on the latest technological advancements and their impacts on our world. And do check out our website at www.itu.int. Until next time, stay curious and keep innovating. Tech Monthly is recorded at ITU headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland, presented by me, Max Jacobson Gonzalez, and produced and edited by Jennifer McLeod. ITU Tech Monthly has been an ITU digital production.